Hello, this is Daniel King reporting on round 5 of the London Chess Classic. Games have only just finished. I found a quiet corner of the venue here at Olympia in London, and we're going to go through the events of the day. It was another thrilling day in London. All 4 games were decisive, and I've picked just one of them to take a look at. The game between Vladimir Kramnik and McShane. Kramnik played pawn to d5, and we had a Slav opening. And McShane played one of his favourites, the so-called Chebanenko variation of the Slav. It's a very fashionable opening. Now you might recall that in the Olympiad, Kramnik exchanged pawns and managed to defeat Aronian in this line. But today he kept more tension in the position. He played g3, which is much more complicated, and I think this was intentional. McShane has been having a rough tournament so far, and somehow his touch isn't there. He's been getting into terrible time pressure, so I think Kramnik wanted to keep things as complicated as possible. So McShane took on c4. Maybe he can play b5 to hold on to this pawn, but Kramnik stopped that. Now the game was transposed into a kind of Catalan. You can see that Kramnik has his bishop raking across the board in typical Catalan fashion. Black's huge problem is how to develop that bishop on c8. Kramnik very much at home in these kind of positions. Luke really plays these kind of positions seldom, and I'm afraid that showed today. Okay, Kramnik simply castled. So you can see already White has quite a big lead in development, but McShane has a pawn on c4. But it's that bishop which is really the key to this game. It makes it very difficult for Black to actually develop on the king side. Now, this has been played before. In fact, there was a game of Kramnik's himself. He's had this position before. The knight comes back. That looks rather mysterious, but really what he's trying to do is at some point perhaps come round, to target the pawn on c4. Queen c7 played. Now in a previous game, Kramnik had played queen d4, actually against Gelfand many years ago, but the game ended very quickly. Somehow this queen maneuver, well, it seems to waste time, and in that game it wasn't very successful. You can see that, well, Kramnik got his pawn back, but they actually agreed a draw here, and I mean, I guess it's playable for White, but doesn't look critical. But Kramnik, who knows how long ago he came up with this improvement, but he played a very interesting idea. He played bishop f4. In fact, it reminded me of the game Adams against Polgar from a few rounds back, where Adams played exactly this idea. He played bishop f4, as Kramnik did here, to provoke e5, and that means that the d5 square has been weakened. So what White now wishes to do is maneuver a knight into d5, exactly as Adams did against Polgar. You might like to refresh your memory and take a look at that game. So the bishop came back to d2. Now maybe it's more sensible to play bishop c5 here, but Luke, well, as is his style, played very uncompromisingly and brought the knight out to c5. Of course, it allows the bishop to come into the game, and maybe the knight can come into b3, so it's logical, but now the game becomes very sharp. It's funny, this bishop coming all the way out to f4, back to d2, and back to g5, but the point is now it's threatened to take on f6. Well, in fact, there's not a lot that Luke can do about that. So this already, I think Kramnik was very happy, very comfortable with this position, because he's managed to damage Black's kingside pawns and gain some control over d5. But, of course, it's not so clear because Luke still has his pawn on c4. And now the game became very sharp indeed. Of course, if White were able to just recapture this pawn, then he's better. He has control over the light squares and has damaged Black's pawn structure. So knight b3 happened. And now Kramnik played a4. He banged this out. This was his intention from a long way back. It's an excellent exchange sacrifice. Take a look what happens if the rook is captured. Queen a4 check. Well, of course, the queen cannot come to d7 because of knight f6 check. Just play that out. So instead, bishop d7, Okay, well, we take on c4, and we're going to recapture the knight here. So, for example, I don't know, bishop g7 is possible. And so then we recapture this knight. Now, this is already tremendous compensation for white, because his minor pieces stand so well. And his queen is very, very active. Perhaps it comes to h5, and then bishop e4. You can see it's all about controlling these light squares. Excellent compensation. But here, I mean, we were looking at this during the game, and we thought probably bishop c5 was the best way for black to play, just to try and get the king out as quickly as possible. Then after rook a4, it's still very, very complicated. I mean, Kramnik considered playing this after the game. He felt that white was still had a reasonable position, but still, I think Luke should probably play like this. But he spent a very long time indeed and came up with rook c8. But after this move, okay, same idea, but this, I think, is looking a bit dubious for black now. Kramnik came up with an excellent idea. Now, if black is allowed to castle, things perhaps aren't so bad, but rook c4. After this, well, I felt Luke was on the edge already. It's an excellent exchange sacrifice, because once that light squared bishop goes, you can see that these squares become so much weaker, and white's minor pieces are just on rock-solid squares and able to control those light squares. I mean, I honestly thought that Luke was lost here, and he was using so much time during the game as well. Okay, knight b5. Of course, if Luke can trade queens, then he's gained something there. But great move from Kramnik. Again, controlling these light squares, these weak squares here. You can see how these double pawns really don't help black's cause at all. And Kramnik now played this so smoothly indeed. As he said after the game, he didn't want to rush it. He wanted to just take his time, keep complete control. You know, it's very much a Kramnik kind of position. Complete control and just cruising in positionally. There's really nothing that black can do. Of course, the king cannot escape to the king side by castling, because then bishop e4, and that's the end of that. And of course, it's impossible to exchange off pieces. The rook on c7 is dominated by the knight on b6. It can't go to these squares. King f8 played, bishop d5. I mean, this is absolutely rotten. Okay, Luke tries to connect his rooks by playing the king up to h6. I mean, if the king goes back, let's have a look. I mean, the queen comes in. I mean, this is just terrible. And for example, here, you can take on f6. Black's position has not improved there. Okay, Luke tried this bizarre idea, king h6. Now, there must be many ways to win this position. But Kramnik saw, if he managed to get a knight to f5, that's checkmate. So he thought, he played a very, in some ways, anti-positional move. However, if you can checkmate your opponent, then who cares that you're giving away the d4 square? So that's the plan, shifting the knight round. So Luke came in with knight d4. Knight e3 was played, and you can see threat, rook takes d4, and knight f5. So Luke had to play f5. Now, of course, you could take this, and you've still got probably a winning position. But queen h3 check was played. And Kramnik said, well, basically the next 10 moves Kramnik had calculated from this position. People talk about Kramnik's positional prowess, but actually he's a brilliant, brilliant calculator as well. So these moves are basically forced. The king has to go back to f8. If it comes to g8, then queen g4. So that's going to be mate, or, well, destruction on g7. So king f8 was played. And now queen g7 is good, but bishop f7 just breaks through straight away. If the king takes this bishop, then it gets checked to oblivion. Well, the king is chased up the board when these moves are pretty simple. Of course, you could take the rook in the corner, but you know, you can just chase the king down the board as well. And until something drops off, you know. for example, and then you take the queen and then you pick up the rook in the corner. It's dreadful. All right, so, I mean, it was incredible that Luke actually managed to get to the time control without losing instantly. You know, he was down to his final few seconds here. So there we go, queen g7, threatening the rook in the corner, and knight takes d4, threatening destruction with knight e6. Rook c6 absolutely forced. Kramnik took this. As I said, he had calculated this all out. He told us after the game. Mate threatened. So Luke has managed to survive. It's incredible. And now, well, this is the final move, the time control. Queen d2. It's probably better just to play king g2 straight away, but okay. Let's see. And now they repeated the position. Now, there's no immediate win for white, but really black has run out of moves here. And Kramnik played a very calm king g2, and that means that he's just actually bringing his king to safety, and then it'll be possible to carry out mayhem on the other side of the board. Rook f7 will lose straight away to queen c8, followed by mate on a8. Luke really doesn't have a move here. He can't play queen takes, for example. Let me see. Well, queen takes e7 is not a bad move. Bishop d6 was played, then b4, and this means that the queen has to leave the protection of one of these two pieces. Okay, Luke holds on to the bishop. Knight d7 check is threatened, so the king came in. And now king h3. Very nice move indeed. That just means that the bishop can now come to d5, and the king is completely safe, so there will be no check here, for example. Yeah, that's the end of that. So Luke played queen d1. Okay, this forces the rook to take the knight. And now, well, Luke is 4 pawns up in this position. And after this, he resigned. Well, there's nothing more to be done. The king is completely open. There are checks, there's the bishop coming here, and all these extra pawns. So that was the end of that. So a really smooth performance from Kramnik. It's incredible the way he managed to get control at such an early stage in the game and really never let that go. So, after 5 rounds, we have Magnus Carlsen leading the tournament with 4 wins and 1 draw. Kramnik just behind 3 wins and 2 draws. And Nakamura, 2 wins and 2 draws. He defeated Judith Polgar today. In the other game, Vishy Anand defeated Garway Jones. Nakamura, as I said, defeated Polgar. And Carlsen defeated Michael Adams. That was also another excellent game from Magnus Carlsen. Thanks very much for watching. More roundup shows, more reports coming tomorrow and for the later rounds in the London Chess Classic. Thank you. Bye.